Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the session Between Two Ferns, Building a Successful Regenerative Medicine Company. My name is Matt Patterson, and I'm joined by Kush Parmar, and we're really thrilled to be here today and to have this conversation that I hope will be helpful to many entrepreneurs and other folks building companies in the regenerative medicine space. So first thing, we'll do quick introductions, and then we'll dive into the discussion that Kush and I have mapped out. So maybe I'll kick it off. And Kush, I'm not going to repeat what people can find on the website, but I will, for at least everyone's benefit, say that Kush Parmar is an MD, Ph.D. He's a managing director at 5am Ventures. He's personally based in Boston. And as many of you know, 5am is very active in the regenerative medicine space. And so we're thrilled to have Kush here to help with the conversation. Full disclosure, Kush and I know each other well. We've worked together, in particular in the context of Audentes Therapeutics, which we'll talk about a bit today, the company that I founded in part with Kush's help. And I think I would be remiss to not also state that Kush, well, not just a outstanding gentleman and a scholar, he also is a man who's passionate about his tequilas and loves professional tennis. Not clear if his personal tennis game is up to snuff, but nonetheless. Anyway, with that, how about Kush?
I can't challenge that doubt, Matt. Thank you for having me. This is great to be with you today, and looking forward to the conversation. Hope it's helpful to the viewers out there as well. And as to you and your background, Matt, I'd love to give a bit of color as well. One thing I'll say that is not on a lot of your CVs, I've actually looked around at different sources and different versions of your bio, that I think needs to be highlighted is the great highlight of Matt being a Bowdoin College graduate. When you meet Matt in person, actually, oftentimes he'll mention it first. It's just not in writing out there. He's a really proud graduate of Bowdoin in New England. And from there, Matt actually took a role that had him gowned up in GMP manufacturing facilities, and I'm searching for photos of that, but I can imagine him as a recent undergraduate coming out into Boston Biotech and gowning up every day for a number of hours. And so I wish I was there in that moment. I didn't have the opportunity. And that was at Genzyme. And you built, on that to three of the most storied companies in rare diseases. Your tenure there at Genzyme, followed by not just in manufacturing, but also in regulatory affairs, and then went on to BioMarin. After that, same on the regulatory affairs and government affairs and commercial planning side of BioMarin. So two of the great, well-known companies in rare diseases where you grew up and developed your own career, and then going to Amicus, working up your way to be president and acting CEO of that company before you're ready to launch this vision. And I felt that you were, the way you approached that, Matt, was really having served a patient community throughout your whole career, and looking at a regenerative medicine company and a gene therapy company to serve that patient population that you had always been serving. So you were working almost backwards from a patient population and class of diseases that you wanted to make an impact with, and looked at these technologies through that lens, and I thought was wonderful. And there, as a true entrepreneur, went out there, hand in hand with some seed money to figure things out, come up with an idea that you didn't really have at the outset, and get people jazzed about that. And after developing that first story, which was torn up a number of times by many of us, including yourself, really got this company an incredible traction and group of people and investors that we'll talk more about. And after a number of private financings and building that company very successfully, really one of the first of that generation of regenerative medicine companies built in that way, raising capital in that way, and then taking it and navigating it into the public markets. It was really such a pleasure to collaborate with you through all those years, Matt. Matt also is an avid fan of the Spurs, and not the basketball team as much. I don't think the basketball team, but really the football team in the UK, which did not give us a lot. A lot of the board meetings that Matt, I ended up having to avoid the topic because it was usually what happened over the weekend wasn't a good outcome. But I think 2018, 2019, I think was a really good season. So and a good one for you and Audentes as well. Anyhow, I'll leave it at that and look forward to the conversation.
That was a much more fulsome description of my background than I was expecting. I appreciate the reference to my first job. I can assure you that after 6-7 hours in the protein purification lab, I always frequently would walk out of there with my hairnet still on. And I'm thrilled that it was so long ago that there was no one with cameras on their phones who could have snapped that and kept that alive for years to come. So, but anyway, thanks for all that. I really appreciate the kind words, Kush. And so with that, let me just say again, our hope with this session is that we can be helpful to entrepreneurs in this space and talk about some of the challenges that we worked on at Audentes, but also that we see today as people are starting new companies. What can we learn from those lessons of the past? And of course, Kush will come at it from the investor's perspective. I'll come at it from former CEO and founder's perspective. So with that, maybe Kush would get a little bit back to the beginning. I think we sort of decided we'd have the conversation in the context of the kicking off of a new company and sort of what it might take. And then a little bit later, we'll get into kind of continuing to build that business and what are the key issues to be thinking about. So, where do you think we should start? Do you want me to give a little context on early days of Audentes?
Yeah, Matt, tell us. I mean, let's get going there with those early days. I mean, it was 2012, sort of the fall of 2012, early 2013. You were going around sort of hand in hand, putting slide decks together. So it was a different time. I mean, we're still coming out of that 2009 sort of crisis period. But looking back, so it might feel very different. But some good lessons to be learned about just how you were developing that initial idea, what was going to resonate for investors, and how you developed that pitch. Yeah, walk us through that.
Yeah, well, it's I'll try to be brief about it, but it's funny to reflect on it because so much has changed over time. For context, and you mentioned it, I spent my career in rare diseases, and I landed at OrbiMed as an EIR, and I was there to look for new orphan or rare disease ideas. And it was through actually a conversation, I think early in 2012 with a CEO of one of the one or two existing AAV companies that was actually out there at the time, who really got me up to speed on the progress of gene therapy in the rare disease community, and opened my eyes to AAV and all the work that had been done primarily in academic labs. But nonetheless, I got excited about being involved in that technology and seeing an advance, in particular for the rare monogenic disease space and patient populations that I was so passionate about. And so through some additional networking, ended up finding this program in myotubular myopathy that jumped out to me right away. And for all the reasons that you know well, it was an early stage program, but with really remarkable initial preclinical data. And it just had all the hallmarks of past successful programs that I'd worked on at Genzyme and BioMarin and Amicus. And so I got really excited about going there and trying to build that into a business in some way so we could see that work advance into a real treatment for patients. But as you undoubtedly recall, my initial pitch to Orbi went over like a lead balloon, to put it politely. It was skepticism bordering on, is this guy crazy, was that initial response. Now, in OrbiMed's defense, we have to put it in the context of the time. Yeah. Here I was going in there and I was pitching a story of, I want to do AAV gene therapy. I want to give a systemic administration to treat this neuromuscular disease. I mean, none of that had even gotten into the clinic yet, much less been proven. And oh, by the way, there's less than 100 boys born in the United States every year with this disease. So it just risk was all over the place from their perspective as an investor. And so it was a difficult conversation, I think, early on, if we're being honest. And to OrbiMed's credit, as you know, of course, they went on to be incredibly strong supporters of the company and have been strongly involved in the regenerative medicine space over the years. But in 2012, no surprise, looking back, that they were skeptical. But I kept at it, and I think that's one of the things that I'm proud of is having the power of conviction if you believe in something, but also having the humility to appreciate people's doubts and questions and to mature the story appropriately, which I tried to do a bit over that year. Finally, after 6 months or so, where I thought it was at a place where it really made sense to go forward, I said, can we please do this? And thankfully they did agree, and I got $1 million of seed funding, which is borderline comical in today's environment, it seems, given the numbers we see for early investments. But $1 million, and the company I got founded in November of 12 and went off and running, as you said, to talk to the world about trying to pitch the story. Hustled out to JP Morgan with my a very low quality PowerPoint presentation, and man, I mean, and just in the hallways, you know, I wasn't a company really, right? So I don't have like a meeting room somewhere. I'm meeting in the Hilton lobby with 50,000 other people. But man, it was a rejection after rejection. You got to be crazy. This is nuts. But finally, and thankfully, and this is where I'll wrap up that early part, was really it came when we met. You know, when I got to 5 a.m. and found you in particular as someone who I think also had an interest in the space, and thankfully, you know, with your vote of confidence, I think that really increased OrbiMed's confidence as well, and to gain momentum. And so as you know, I've always given you a lot of credit for helping me get there. And after a few more months, we obviously closed the Series A in July of 13 of $30 million, which again seems so quaint in this environment, but nonetheless a proud accomplishment, certainly for me. Anyway, so that's sort of the initial idea. There's a lot to unpack there, I think, and how to apply it for the future. But that's how it got started.
Well, one thing I think that does relate to the commonality of then and now is that Series A pitch of 30 million got us was going to take us to clinical data, I think, and that was distant memory pretty quickly later. I think I still see that today with regenerative medicine startups, you know, really striving. And I think those of us investors will get to later and how we think about these, especially those of us who've been involved in these kinds of companies and building them, I think have a healthy sense of the capital requirements for these companies. So, I mean, looking back on that, I mean, so many things we learned, and hopefully we can talk about more.
Yeah. Well, so what was it when, let's go back to that, when we met, and I think I remember coming to the office in Waltham for 5 a.m. and pitching it, and obviously it went well, but there must have been some aspects of it that made it interesting or attractive to you. It sounded to me at the time like you'd already been looking a little bit into gene therapy as a treatment option for some of these rare diseases in particular. But anyway, besides my dynamic personality, what made it an interesting opportunity at that point?
Well, don't take away your credit, man. I mean, you and your credibility in the field and your longstanding commitment to the patients that you're looking to serve through Audentes, I mean, was a big part of it, absolutely big part of it. And the belief, oftentimes teams are not all fully baked out at the beginning, you know, and we as a firm being used to being involved in early stage, we're used to that of, you know, what's that nucleus here and can you build around that? And we really felt strongly after getting to know you that you could really assemble and recruit a wonderful team around you. I think the other part of that about you, Matt, is not just your background, but, you know, these are the beginnings of a journey. You know, we're not in and out of these companies at all. It's a long-standing, we call it a marriage. And they're in the process of having conversation and dialogues with you, Matt. I mean, we realize that your approach and your thoughtfulness, your open-mindedness to, and your humility to sort of address things that you might not know or might not be considering gave us, me personally, a huge amount of confidence that we could be real partners in helping each other to make the company be really successful. That dynamic is huge, and we'll speak to maybe later about that being a really core ingredient. The other part is the readiness piece. I mean, as you pointed out, and for entrepreneurs going to talk to other investors for the first time, having a little bit of color on, have they invested in this space before? How knowledgeable are they? I think, you know, probably helpful. Yes, we've done a landscape overview, and where we came out of that was to be investing in rare genetic diseases. This gene therapy field was probably ripe, but where it's going to be most productively ripe initially was going to be in this arena for all the reasons that you know. And here you were coming with a wonderful plan, a really powerful initial program. And so that combination was terrific. And OrbiMed, again, another piece to consider is how everyone around the table works well together, not just you as an individual entrepreneur. Was a firm we knew well. We also had a great collaborative relationship with as well. So those were three things that I think set us up well to say, yeah, this is bold. And yes, we as a firm had never done a real rare disease company up until then, and had never really done a gene therapy company up until then either. So a double whammy in that regard, but I think we were thinking actively about both areas as really productive areas for us to get involved in.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think we've talked about this before for entrepreneurs that are trying to get something started and thinking about talking to investors, really thinking about who you're talking to, both the firm and the people, and trying to, if you can, focus your time on folks that maybe have a history of interest or comfort investing in something with the risk profile that many of these businesses have, which is, let's be honest, pretty high. That makes a big difference, and because it's hard to meet with the world, right? And of course, the world has evolved a lot, and that there's so many more investors now that are investing in this space than there were back then. But nonetheless, I think it's still good to try to target folks that you think would be a good fit for what you're trying to do with your business.
So Matt, looking back, all the history, and you've seen the field evolve so much since then. How would you have pitched it differently now, or how would you be pitching it differently today relative to back then? And any advice for leaders out there trying to pitch their regenerative medicine story these days?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are a few areas where I would change things up. On the specifics of the pitch, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I started just initially with MTM, and I think it just was too risky, and so one thing that I did over time as a sort of response to that was, okay, let's actually build a pipeline here that gives us multiple shots on goal to try to build value for the business and therefore for the shareholders. So we ended up adding, Pompe and Duchenne to the pipeline before the Series A and even before the seed money came in. And I think that helped the story evolve. So having an appreciation for the risk inherent, I think, in the business, I was sort of all in right away. Thought it was, this is going to work. It's going to work. But I didn't really appreciate well enough, I think, that initial response. So taking that in stride and appreciating that people are going to question your idea. They're going to have some doubts initially, especially if you're working with really cutting edge ideas. But that's okay. Take that in stride and have the humility to listen to that. And that's a general theme that I say all the time. My friends hear it from me all the time is I feel like from leadership, successful leadership is about a balance between confidence and humility. And I think trying to find that from every stage, from founding all the way through is really important. Also I think, we added to the pipeline. I think I would have done that sooner. I also probably would have had a stronger perspective on technical operations, specifically manufacturing and analytics. As you know, and we'll talk about in a minute, that ended up being the biggest roadblock in the building of the company, the biggest challenge we ended up dealing with. And in retrospect, I don't think I did enough homework initially. I was a little too, hey, I know rare disease biologics manufacturing. I was at Genzyme and I was at BioMarin, but the truth is I didn't know anything about AAV manufacturing and how much more complex it was. And so in retrospect, I wish I'd done more work there to mature the story. And that's an area I'll come back to as something that I think even today, with all the work that's happened in tech ops, that still needs to be an area of great focus for new stories. So, and then finally, I'd say the power of conviction. I mean, you still got to have the confidence to push forward with your idea. And I think I would still do that. I felt like I had it pretty good, but I tried to be a good listener. I forgot to throw in, by the way, at the beginning that one of the most amazing moments, painful and stressful moments of getting it started was when Orbi decided to do the Series Seed, the $1 million. I had to go through this formal approval process with the full partnership, and it's in front of everyone, and I'm pitching the idea, and it was largely already done because Jonathan had blessed it as, he had his support. But at this big meeting in front of everyone, one of the very senior people at the firm, who will go unnamed, said, at the end of my talk, he said, "Matt, gene therapy?" And I was like, yeah, it's going to be great. It's going to work. Name withheld. He's like, "Matt, gene therapy?" And, I said, "Yeah." And meanwhile, underneath my shirt, I'm starting to sweat profusely because I feel like, oh my God, is my idea dead? And he said, "You know what they say about gene therapy, right? It's the science of the future, and it always will be." Anyway, that was a really difficult moment for an entrepreneur, but luckily it went forward, and hey, the future is here, I would say.
Yeah, that's right, very much so.
Benefiting. So anyway, anyway, those are some reflections.
Good advice, man.
Good. Well, let's go back to you and talk a little bit about your sense of kind of the state of the union more today than 2013 when we were talking about Audentes. I mean, really amazing evolution of the space, right, over this relatively short period in terms of our careers. But I know you guys see a lot of different things. I'd love to hear more about, kind of what you're seeing generally, how many maybe you're seeing on a regular basis, and I think people would always value hearing what distinguishes a certain opportunity as more interesting than another. From your perspective, without giving away all the important secrets that 5AM maintains, of course, and how it's successful in the space. But yeah, I'm sure people would love to hear more about kind of what you're seeing today and how you're thinking about the space.
Yeah, no, and I'll try to be very careful about all the proprietary insights we have.
Yes.
Man, I have to be. Well, gosh, how can you compare? It's like night and day. I mean, 2013, 2012 versus now. And I will tell you, so in that fund 3, which was an '09 fund for us, and these venture funds, they have a life, and they're raised often every 2 to 3 years, and each fund will have some number of companies in that portfolio. And so out of the 15 companies or so, give or take, in that fund 3, this was the one gene therapy investment in that fund. Here we are now, fast forward, we're in fund 6 that we're investing out of. And they're at various stages, some of them seed, some of them sort of major positions now. Out of also 15 companies, that'll be fund 6, we have 6 companies that are in some way or form regenerative medicine companies. So that tells you a little bit about, and we have to tell you, are very conscious about diversification of our portfolios. It's fairly concentrated at 15 companies per fund. And so we don't want necessarily the whole fund, or 2/3 of it, to be in oncology or something like that. But just the nature of the opportunity set and the richness of these toolkits that are available to tackle just problems that we couldn't even conceive of tackling. It's why we're doing this, right? And I think there's a greater and greater set of precedents for these. The capital markets, we'll get to that later, are enabling them more. That was always the thing that would really, cell therapy, oh my goodness, you're gonna have to build this ginormous facility. There's no way to do that in this day and age. So today, all that stuff is much more possible. And so as a result, I think what's very, very different, Matt, from 2012, 2013 is the competition is incredible, because we're seeing so many opportunities. I would say out of a couple, I'd say 400 or so that we see every year, at least a third, maybe half of them are in some kind of complicated modality, and a lot of them falling into the category of regenerative medicine. So, and we end up making 4 or 5 new investments in a year. So there's a lot of substrate coming here. I would say that with Audentes, it was such a clearly unique story at that time, much less crowded. There were a few other companies, but not nearly like it is today. So for us, the bar ends up being truly around the problem set that you're solving that's truly unique, and much has to be very, very crisp in our view, rather than technology that is sort of riding on a space that is clearly hot, or a transaction that is validated that the space is hot, and trying to come in on the heels of that. Us as a firm, I think we try and stay away from that. If we can't see go through the distance of a clinical impact that's really unique in a very crowded field. So it's challenging for entrepreneurs, it's also for investors, I have to say, to really have that crystal ball as we're looking at these opportunities. We think a lot about teams and financing requirements. So because there's so many companies, and because these companies raise quite a bit of capital, recruiting people who have experience in this space is extremely time intensive and hard. So making sure the team and the people around the team actually have the time, the commitment to, and the ability to do that. And also appreciating from the team that there's some humility or realism about the capital requirements that are going to be required for the business, and that it's built and launched in such a way as well. I think we look out for those things really clearly, because if we see plans that are way too skinny or way too idealistic, it is a bit of a yellow flag that, boy, I mean, this takes more than that to be able to launch and build a great company that's going to be resilient and robust.
Yeah. Sort of on a related note there, do you think when you're investing, do you think at all or worry at all about, gee, who's going to buy this business in the future? Or do you think of it in terms of more, can this group, can they build a successful company? And you know, we'll see, right, if it ends up being a publicly traded company or gets acquired someday. But do you worry much about that, where it might fit into the profile or into the portfolio of a larger company in the future, or not so much?
You know, we do. I have to say, we don't obsess about it in terms of near-term outcome, but we ask that question of, if you look at, investors think about certainly private M&A and things like that, but a big thesis of what has led to a lot of robustness in the public markets has been this path that, you know, to build the company and take it further, and then have some kind of partnering outcome on the other side of that. So instead of hundreds of millions of dollars, those companies, you know, are really being partnered for in the multiple billions, of course. And so at some juncture, I think one thinks about it a little bit, and that flows backwards from, Matt, from the uniqueness of the clinical problems that you're going to be addressing, and having conviction in those solutions, because those are real problems, and you have a unique solution set. At some point or another, creating a very substantial value that larger companies are ultimately going to see as well.
Yeah. Okay. Very helpful. Good. Well, why don't we push on? I'm sensitive to time a little bit, so I think we're going to move now to talking about more of the company growth, I suppose, after getting out of the gate. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that's perfect. So, I mean, let's go back. Series A is closed. You have a nice syndicate. You're feeling really, you know, with an incredible balance sheet of $30 million that'll give you runway forever. But then you got to grow fast. And you know, what was the key to that velocity of growing on the team side, on the operational side, and what were those? I mean, the challenges as well, Matt.
Yeah. Well, you just mentioned the team. I mean, it's not as exciting sometimes as the science that we talk about, but the simple reality is you do have to hire a great team to make this thing go. I often say that you could have the most amazing scientific hypothesis of all time in the history of biotech, but your idea is not going to go anywhere if you can't hire and retain a really talented people who get up every morning and come to work, or at least get to their computer these days, and really push it along. So thankfully, and I try to lay, you know, the foundation for that the Series A, right? Having put out to my network, whether it's Genzyme or Parmar or Amicus or elsewhere, to try to identify folks in those key positions where I knew I wanted to have someone right away. So thankfully, with the Series A in the bank, I was able to really hire those people pretty quickly, and that was absolutely key. You know, on a related note, another thing I often I focus on a lot at Audentes, and I encourage other CEOs to do, is to focus on the culture of the organization. It's an incredible time in biotech. There's money everywhere. There's zillions of companies. So finding people and retaining them is hard. It's hard. And and it's not just about what you can pay them and what benefits you have. I really do believe that if you create an environment where they really enjoy being a part of this team, then they're much more likely to stay and to work hard to achieve the goals you've laid out. So the team definitely stood out for me as the most important, I think. We executed well. I think the board was comfortable that we were at that. Certainly had some delays that that made my initial timeline in that Series A pitch a little naive, optimistic. But hey, you got to be optimistic to be a biotech CEO. And the data continued to be really strong, which of course helped a lot. No surprise, the gene therapy field really picked up steam, right? So of course we had some tailwinds there, and having such a strong syndicate with Orbi5AM and Versant to start really helped us too. The key challenge, I mentioned it earlier, and let's talk openly about it, was manufacturing. I think I underappreciated the complexity of it when we first got started. I did assume we were using a partner organization in Europe to help us with manufacturing. And the plan was to have them do the work until a certain stage and then likely move to a CMO of some kind. And we had a major setback when we were shifting from smaller scale to larger scale manufacturing, getting ready to start our long-term toxicology studies, and it was painful. Basically had to reboot the entire manufacturing system and find a place to do it. And then to set back on the timeline. And I remember the board meeting having to walk through this, and it was maybe the most painful meeting that I had as a CEO. Was that we were an 18 to 24 month delay, and trying to be honest about it. There was a little crystal balling in there. I wasn't actually sure, but that was really brutal. We had to push our IND back accordingly. Now the flip side of it, the silver lining of it, was that we scrambled to look at our options for manufacturing and ended up putting forth a proposal to do it internally, which of course most of my friends thought was totally insane. We were 18 months before the clinic. We want to invest in internal large-scale GMP manufacturing for AAV. It was aggressive in the moment, but it always felt like the right call. And sure enough, those naysayers aren't around anymore, right? Because the field has obviously evolved to a place where there's just been massive investment in that. And in our case in particular, it was critical because we were working in neuromuscular disease with higher doses. And it just led to, so much future success for the business, including hitting timelines and control over our programs and really being able to drive things forward. And of course, in the end, the acquisition from Astellas, there was no question that they valued that aspect of the business in addition to the programs. So I'm very passionate about tech ops, but I learned some tough lessons during that time. But thankfully, we got through it, and then of course, and eventually got into the clinic, and the initial data was just so amazing that it really helped us build. Also added programs over time, to the pipeline. Lost my way a little bit, I would say, on strategic focus. This is another message I try to share with entrepreneurs is, especially when you're working with cutting edge, complex science, I really appreciate a company that has a strategic focus initially in terms of the technology and or its therapeutic area that it's working in. It's really difficult to be an expert at all kinds of different complex things and to have your whole team be experts in that. And so, and when we added to the pipeline, we drifted into liver and cardiac. And while at the time they were, I think, reasonable decisions, we ended up drifting back to our core area of expertise, which was neuromuscular, adding programs in Duchenne and myotonic. And that was absolutely the right call. And so strategic focus and kind of growing thoughtfully is another concept that I encourage folks to think about, in particular in the regenerative medicine space where the science is complex.
Well, Matt, you might not love this, but I actually tell every regenerative medicine entrepreneur that comes through my door or we've invested in about the challenge of that board meeting that we faced with that CMC based delay. And I have to tell you, I brought that to bear in any subsequent regenerative medicine investment we've made. It's in terms of our philosophy to the importance of really mastering that, not underestimating it whatsoever. and building a degree, several degrees of resilience around that, because it's sort of where it's what make or breaks these companies early on. So it's, I mean, you learned a lot, but I think a lot of the industry, and certainly I did a ton.
Yeah, well, I'm glad my pain could be helpful.
Yeah, we felt it together then.
Yeah, that's true. Well, but that was actually one of my follow-up questions for you, was in these more recent companies you've invested in, you know, does tech ops / manufacturing / supply chain, is that generally the area where you see the most stumbles, and you encourage the company to kind of focus and ensure you've got really good investment in that core base of skill?
Massively important. And if they're entrepreneurs that sort of feel strongly about kind of lean, outsourced kind of approach, I get the rationale. Oftentimes, it's formidable to take on the manufacturing piece and internalizing that. But even at the get-go, I mean, for us, it was sort of a little bit further into the A, but now for us, even into the seed period, we're thinking about that consciously. And Series A, we are thinking about that leadership at the helm. I mean, really early on in these companies. So 100%. I think the other thing I was just going to reiterate is what resonated so much to me with how you wanted to build Audentes was you were really very focused on the clinical applications, almost to an extreme relative to other regenerative medicine companies among some of the peers, and even some of the companies since then, where there's a very conscious choice of not obsessing on the technology and the newest and shiniest flavors of the technology, but really working with technology that's working quite well, and now let's execute really, really well, make great medicines efficiently and thoughtfully. And I think this is one investor data point here. I can't speak for all. I still continue to feel I have that lens as I look at new opportunities. Want to see that in an entrepreneur, that they're heading somewhere towards that clinical impact, as opposed to some that really can fall in love with their technologies, and that comes to the focus, Matt. So I don't want to belabor that. The board dynamics and co-investors, there's so much to be thoughtful about with new companies, but those are a couple that I would emphasize as important, so we can move on.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Let's
so, you know, we over the course of Audentes, right? We had these conversations about MTM. You brought up the point of how many X-linked MTM, how many patients are born every year. We had an internal conversation about it when we were even first investing, and this is something that you continued across the whole pipeline to discuss internally and with investors along the way. So if you're jumping in today, I mean, how would things differ? I mean, what challenges remain that you'd focus on? One area being this, I mean, commercial strategy. Now that the regenerative medicine field is getting into its more of an adolescent kind of phase, where people are getting closer to launches now, how would you think about that today?
Yeah, I think it's a critical, well, it's one of the most important subjects we have going on in the field as a conversation, because in the end, all this work we're doing will mean nothing if patients can't get access to these medicines. And so it's not just about the classic rare disease challenges of finding the patients. It's about ensuring that you can deliver not just a safe and effective medicine, but also one that gets paid for. And so you really have to think in that context. Now, the good news is that there's a tremendous amount of momentum and progress, I think, in the space, as far as thinking creatively about alternative payment structures, payment over time, things that don't fit well into the current paradigm of how we pay for medicines here in the United States and elsewhere. But it's incredibly important that we think creatively about how to pay for these medicines, and therefore ensure that payers are comfortable with getting these medicines paid for and getting them to patients as soon as possible. So the commercial strategy, and I think my guess is, and you know better than I, that investors have also gotten more savvy about this. you're monitoring recent launches of these products and seeing what's working, what's not. The cell therapy space in particular, incredible supply chain challenges that have to be solved. So ensuring that that's an important part of your conversation early with investors, being on the ball as far as what the current landscape is for how your product may get paid for, and doesn't mean you have to have it solved, but it does mean that you're being thoughtful about it, because I think that's crucial and will continue to be an area of great focus for investors over time. I also think the regulatory environment has evolved a lot. It's in my opinion, in a very positive way, and we see that largely driven by the leadership of Peter Marks at Sieber and how passionate he and his team, and before him Scott Gottlieb, of course, as commissioner. They're very passionate about the space and seeing it advance, and that's been wonderful. That being said, I think it's still important to listen and to see areas where they have important questions, and it really comes back to tech ops. I mean, what I see is that, and Peter talks about this a lot in public forums, is he still doesn't see enough focus on manufacturing and analytics to ensure that we really understand these products before they can get approved. So I think knowing what we know now, I think if I was pitching something and offering folks suggestions on what to prepare for, tech ops is still there, being thoughtful about regulatory, listening to what the agency is saying, and really thinking hard about the commercial strategy and getting involved in that conversation. Don't just sit around at your own company, but get out there and work with ARM or other organizations who are actively trying to ensure we live in a world where patients can get access to these medicines. Let's push on. I want to push on to financing. You mentioned it a little bit in your earlier remarks, but really amazing time, right? I mean, it's incredible the size of first financings, and the IPO market, despite COVID, has been amazing all year. Maybe just a little bit on your thoughts of that environment, but also, when you mentioned it's one of your things you think about when you're investing in a new business is, realistically, maybe not the rose-tinted glasses view of the founder CEO who's sitting across from you, but really realistically, what do we think the capital needs of this business are going to be, and are we comfortable with that number and being a part of that story? So if you could speak to that a little bit, I think people would appreciate it.
Yeah, I think now, entrepreneurs can be thinking a bit longer term, right? I think back then, 2012, 2013, it was always from one financing to the next, as far as you could look out, and trying to hope you get some good milestones along the way. And I think now one does have the luxury to be thinking a little bit further out. And I think investors like to see that in entrepreneurs, thinking through the long-term trajectory of the company towards clinical impact. How do you get out there and envision that as a standalone business? That invariably indicates some kind of path to the public markets, given the capital intensiveness of these businesses. And I think one has the ability to absolutely do that. I will say that manufacturing and tech ops as a thesis to say someone is going to acquire you just because of that, I think that there has been a lot of partnering, and big companies have all sorts of technologies now in their sort of toolkit, frankly underutilized in a lot of them. And so I think, barring something really, really different, to give them some huge capability that they don't, many of the big companies now have some ability to do complex medicines. So I actually really think, go back to what I'm just keep talking about, is clinical products ultimately are what's going to drive a lot of the value creation and allow you to build a sustainable independent business.
Yep.
And also allow other kinds of conversations as well. And because as long as that optionality, you're retaining that with real products at the helm, the capital markets, thankfully, are really there to support those companies for sure. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I echo that. I'm very passionate about making sure you get that lead program into the clinic and show that your science works, and you can have a powerful impact for patients. In the background, solve your technical operations issues so you've got the substance behind it all to build from. and then, advance the rest of your pipeline or expand into other areas or whatever it might be. But, I do think that's key to building these businesses. And again, it comes back down to the risk. And if you're working with novel science, you really need to get to the proof of concept, and you need to get there in humans.
Yeah.
As soon as you can. So,
And I like to talk to entrepreneurs about really financing through substantial milestones. And I realize companies these days, like always, are always fundraising, and they're always doing the next financing, but really not being too skinny on the financings when one can, to really robustly fund these companies. It buys down risk enormously in this kind of company.
Yeah.
Matt, what's your take on just the kinds of investors that you've seen? You've interacted with so many, from early to late to private, but what all those investors are doing today versus what they were doing in 2012, 2013 are quite different, right? Where some of them started to gravitate towards earlier stage, the amount of checks and the check sizes they need to invest in these companies has evolved as well.
Yeah.
And their experience and sophistication in the field too has also changed.
Yeah, in addition to the size of these financings, I think we can all agree that one of the major shifts in investing in biotech over the years has been more of the classically public-oriented investors doing more private investing, and including in the regenerative medicine space. Now, in general, I think that's a good thing. But again, I also think it's important to be thoughtful about the perspective each of those investors has, and what their expectations are for building the business in the near term. And a lot of this comes around to IPO timing. And so one thing I've been saying to colleagues, and it's been particularly true in 2020, where the market is so aggressively funding IPOs. It gives me some pause, I have to say, even though I love the phrase that no biotech CEO ever said the words, "I raised too much money." But the reality is, especially when it comes to going public, I think it's really important to be thoughtful about it, and not just ensure that you've got a strong story at the time of that transaction, but also that you can execute successfully for the next 18 to 24 months, and that you don't fall on your face right out of the gate and lose credibility and labor to build value from there. So I think that's important, and something that I always stress for folks, in particular during times like this, where everyone's just really big on getting out there. But I do still have to be very thoughtful about it. So, good. Okay, we're running short on time, but we're near the end here. We're at the famous crystal ball time, Kush. Everyone's favorite question. It's been, I'm not sure actually if we could have predicted in 2012, 2013 that the world would look like it does today in terms of investment in this space, and the clinical impact that we're seeing, the entire environment. It's really a remarkable 8 years or so, but still it's fun to think ahead to what we think might be the case at least the next few years. I don't know, one or two ideas on what you think, not specific investments necessarily, but I'm talking about just the field generally. What's your level of optimism these days about the near term?
So, a couple of things on the financial markets, capital markets, and access to capital, which is less specific to the science, which I'd love to touch on too. And I feel there's been a secular shift in how capital has viewed and has come to appreciate where the de-risking and the value creation happens in biotech, and the translation ultimately of breakthroughs into that early clinical experience. I think people have now appreciated that is a massively important time to be creating value. And a lot of that risk can be bought down by upfront capital investments. And so I think that's why there's this shift of buying down that risk early, and then being public, and then one is getting these investors, I think, in capital is seeing venture-like returns in the public markets. And so that's and that's been something that's been building up for years. I think this year under COVID, because of this hyper acute awareness for biotech and this whole industry, and its, frankly, its relevance and its value to society, I think there's been huge shifts into the sector. I don't think it's just accentuated a trend that we've seen going on for some time. So I don't see that changing in my crystal ball dramatically. I I think for me, in terms of the next set of big opportunities, global access is a huge one. I mean, you brought this up. We need to obviously tackle one thing at a time in terms of just access in, say, the United States or in European countries, but around the world, we need to be thinking very much about the relevance of the regenerative medicine field to the world, because it'll be a disservice, huge disservice, if we can't connect that somehow. So I think there will be technological solutions. There's certainly some non-technical solutions to that, but I actually think there will be technological solutions and huge value creation for those that are able to crack that. And I can't wait to be involved in those kinds of stories personally. I also think, I'm sure you've had many ARM panels on this topic of bringing this to less rare indications, right? It's clearly been the first wave, what we've seen, and dramatic breakthroughs for patients there, but how do we responsibly bring them and still make them commercially viable, by the way, because otherwise they won't really make a difference, to less rare diseases. And, for me, this is just a category. There are many categories of regenerative medicine efforts. I mean, we have an effort within the firm, I'll say, that's looking at a minor subset of regenerative medicine, which is to do in situ or in vivo, transdifferentiation. That's like a small little pocket, an important one, an interesting one, that a firm like us is already, saying, hey, what's going on here? So I think what we think of as regenerative medicine, even for ARM, I'm sure you've been adapting that over time because you got to follow the science. That's going to be building in time as well. So those are some examples there. The autologous stuff, as you said, it's going to be really interesting to see how we can, as in developed societies first, really make these accessible to patients. And that's going to take a lot of stakeholders to get there.
Yeah, great. Well, some really important thoughts there. I appreciate that.
How about you, Matt?
Well, I mean, I'll be brief, and I think I'll just focus for a second back on that balance of confidence and humility that I hope people will have going into the space, because you need both, right? I like seeing companies appreciate the complexity of their science and put together a plan that manages that. It's a little easy to get out over our skis, I think, right now as an industry, because there is so much incredible excitement, and rightfully so, in the regenerative medicine space, driven by amazing patient outcomes in clinical trials and some regulatory approvals. But nonetheless, I think it's still critical that people appreciate there are huge challenges still to be solved. And that it comes back to patients and ensuring patients can get access. And again, not just in the United States, where we have plenty of challenges, but as you say, around the world. And it just gives me heartburn to think of significant delays in patient access to these completely life-changing medicines because we couldn't get through a conversation about new payment structures or how to ship cells from one place to another in a timely manner. I mean, we have to solve those challenges, and not just assume that getting that IND filed and getting a trial started and raising money as a public company is the end all be all, right? It's completely loses the perspective of what we need, which is that patients get access to these medicines, because that's what we all want. And in the end, when we're all old and sitting around and reflecting on our careers, that's what I want to remember, is that that patients benefited from it. It's nice to build great businesses as well, but I think the patient focus is fundamental. Thank you, Kush, for having the conversation with me, and everyone out there. I hope it was somewhat helpful, and I really look forward to being supportive of companies developing in this space. And thanks to ARM, my colleagues at ARM, for giving us the chance to talk today. So.